Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a CPA that's worked in the investment and financial services industries. I've also started multiple companies that have achieved millions of dollars in revenue, and I've sold companies with multi-million dollar valuations. You can find out more about my background at our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast, to join us in conversations that we have every week outside of the podcast. Lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get the weekly updates when we post the video version every week on Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us each and every week to discuss business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, the last few episodes, we've been focusing on personality traits and talents, or the importance of traits and talents, but really honing in on personality traits. And we built the foundation a few episodes ago in episode 24. In episode 25, we talked about the importance of those personality traits for yourself, doing self-assessment and identifying what personality traits you have, the good, bad, and the ugly. And today, we're going to conclude this three-part series, if you will, on traits by talking about how personality traits can help create incredibly high-performing teams. So, first, I think it's important that we understand why team composition matters. If you think about any of the teams you've participated on in the past, you can probably relate that a team's success isn't solely determined by the individual talents of its members, but also by how those talents interact and complement each other. If you think about any sports team, you have multiple positions. And of course, people with certain talents and traits fit well within those positions, whether it's a quarterback or a linebacker or a running back or a wide receiver, talking specifically about American football. And so when you're thinking about business and when you're thinking about creating teams within business, and this can be just who you hire, and you think about the culture of your overall company, or if you're a larger organization and you need to create teams to accomplish certain strategic objectives across departments, this is another example of where the conversation we're going to have today of not just mumbo jumbo putting teams together and randomly picking people for whatever reason, but being strategic and thinking about what is the goal of this team? What are we trying to accomplish? And what personality traits are best going to be combined to ultimately achieve the mission of the team, whether it's your whole company, whether it's a strategic team within a department, etc. And so by identifying and leveraging those unique personality traits of the team members, you can create incredibly successful teams that thrive and achieve the overall results that you're trying to accomplish. So, first, let's talk about the power of the personality traits. Then we're going to talk about what are some traits to look for and how can you identify them. And lastly, let's talk about how you can utilize those traits once you've identified them within individuals to build an effective team. And then you can't just build a team and let it go. You have to monitor it and balance those teams' traits from time to time. Sometime a team that you start out well, as things progress, you realize, okay, maybe I missed a personality trait or a particular team member that has this personality trait, and you might need to make adjustments. So let's talk about personality traits in the context of team dynamics. As we've said in the past, personality traits influence how individuals think, how they behave, how they relate to others, and those particular things can ultimately shape how they communicate within a team, their styles, how they make decisions, and overall how they contribute to either a company's culture, a team's culture, just the culture overall. Now, think about companies that you've been in where you've had good culture, or think about the culture of your own business. Why is the culture that you have what it is? If you boil it down, and culture often starts at the top, and this is why it's so important for us as excuse me, business owners and entrepreneurs to identify or self-assess our own personality traits because those have such a big impact on the company's culture. But where is that culture ultimately stemming from? Well, it's coming from the people who collectively make up that organization. And that boils down to personality traits and talents. We made a distinction between traits and talents, talents being something that you can develop over time, the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hour concept to become an expert in a particular talent, versus personality traits with which are far more genetic in nature and more lasting and enduring throughout one's lifetime. Your go-to default character traits, I guess, or how you react in certain situations, or what traits manifest themselves. And so, when you think about the importance of personality traits within a team, you can't just decide you're going to throw a team together without realizing that if you combine two type A personalities, for example, strong, confident extroverts, typically related with type A personalities. And we'll talk about some of the traits that I think and I found historic or in my experience in business and just in everyday life when creating teams are ones to hone in on and how you can use those like a puzzle to create a good team. But if you combine two very strong leaders on one team, you could have problems. And I think that we've seen this, or I've seen this within corporate America, where you have two leaders. And ultimately, when the overall goal of the team is to achieve a particular mission, there becomes infighting because the personality traits of some of the individuals, particularly in the case we're talking about, the strong extroverted leadership type personalities start clashing. And so, if you don't recognize how important it is to strategically piece together teams based on personality traits, you may ultimately result in an example where the overall mission of what you're trying to accomplish with the team is far less important to those within that team than infighting and personal politics. And I've seen that a lot in corporate America. Those of you who have worked in corporate America, I'm sure you've seen the same thing. And it's very destructive to the overall culture of the team. And so it can't be understated how important this concept of thinking about personality traits before you create a team and then using them as a business owner or an entrepreneur to assemble the right team that has a diverse range of talents and skills that can basically tackle what you're trying to accomplish, the overall challenge that you're trying to accomplish. When I think about, I've had multiple companies, I currently have multiple companies, and when I think about hiring, one of the most important things I think about is what is this particular individual's goal? Number one, what is their actual job responsibility? But also, how do they fit within the overall culture of our organization? And oftentimes, when I'm hiring for, let's say in the garbage business, when I was hiring for a driver, obviously they had to have certain license qualifications, although we would train people even if they didn't have the necessary licenses, so that we could get the right people. And I've said this in the past, and I think all entrepreneurs realize with time, sometimes we have to fail to learn this, and I certainly did. Hiring for personality is far more important to me than hiring for talents or hiring for skills. Now, there are certain jobs that you have to have certain qualifications. If you're a doctor, okay, not anybody can be a doctor. What's interesting is generally, personality traits often align with people that become doctors. And attention to detail, for example, if you're going to be a heart surgeon, empathy or sympathy. If you're someone that's in the emergency room and you're dealing with people that obviously need some of that when you're caring for them, you actually have to care about the patients that you're working on. The ability to remain calm under pressure if you're in the surgical room as a ER doctor. So those are often personality traits that find themselves into those specific careers. And we could talk for a whole episode on, okay, what traits are there and what careers are good for those traits. And maybe we'll do that at some point. But the point in saying all this is, if you think about the particular traits that you need in your company, and as I was talking about when I hire, I'm not just hiring for a job. I'm hiring for a person. I'm hiring for a personality. I'm hiring for someone that's going to build to the overall company culture, not just achieve some job responsibility. And I think that's often missed. And so if you are building your company and you're consistently making hiring, think about that. That should be at the top of your list for any hire, regardless of what the job responsibility is. Is this someone whose personality traits, their natural go to tendencies, is going to fit well within our organization and the culture that we've built? Now, when you're hiring and when you're thinking about personality traits, what are some things you should be looking out for? And how can you identify them? That's important. Obviously, we talked about in the previous episode identifying them within ourselves, but how do you identify it for other people? And first off, what are some that you can look for? Now, there's obviously many personality traits out there. And last week I talked about the 7 that I believed were really crucial for each of us as business owners and entrepreneurs to self-assess and to think about. And today we want to talk about looking at others and what traits should you be looking for to create effective teams. So, as I said, there's a lot of them. Some of them are similar to what we've talked about in doing our own self assessment. So, I just want to go through a few important ones, the top, 5 or 6 that I typically look for, depending on the role or responsibility of the position I'm trying to fill. And this is important for leadership teams as well. So it's not just hiring for, uh, you know, any type of job within the organization. I think it's crucial no matter what position within your company you're looking to fulfill. So we talked about the first one that I think is obvious to a lot of people: extroversion. That's someone that's generally outgoing, energetic, pretty sociable, and they gain energy from interacting with others. That's someone that I would consider myself an extrovert. And then the opposite of that is introvert. Someone who's a little bit more reserved, they're a little bit more reflective. They prefer being in solitude, if you will, to recharge their overall energy. Think about the position that you're looking to hire for, if that's what we're talking about, or in the team. Oftentimes, the best teams have a combination of extroverts and introverts. I've said this in the past: our society seems to give the most media attention or the most attention to extroverts, especially very extroverted CEOs. You can think of Jack Welch from General Electric, huge extrovert, always on TV. He's since passed away. But extroverts naturally tend to garner a lot of attention just because they're out in the public eye, and that's how they recharge their battery. But don't be fooled by that. There are incredible benefits from introverts. And if you read the book From Good to Great, you actually, one of the things that it talks about is how there are some CEOs who are far better off being introverts, even though that's not typically what we think of in our society. And so when we're talking specifically about creating teams in this podcast. And when you're thinking about a management team or a leadership team, you really got to be thinking about what type of personality trait do you want leading the head of your organization. For those of us that are small business owners or entrepreneurs, that's why we have to self-assess ourselves, because we're typically the ones leading the organization and really drive that company culture. But if you're in a larger organization, or if you're on a board and you're responsible for leading the charge of hiring the next CEO, you cannot do that in my belief, in a well-mannered way, or you're not going to be successful if you haven't thought about the personality traits of the individual that you want to lead the organization. Another one that I think is important to identify, and sometimes you want this and sometimes you don't, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, is assertiveness. That's often associated with extroverts, but not always. But someone who's confident, they're decisive, and they're relatively self assured individuals, and they're comfortable expressing their opinions, sometimes even when they don't need to or people don't want to hear them. If you look at successful teams, I think you'll see there's usually one or two that are assertive, but there's got to be a balance there. Because one of the challenges when you're building a team is if you have a or you have a relatively assertive individual, you don't want them to take all of the oxygen in the room and essentially prevent those who are maybe less assertive from speaking up. And we'll get to one of the other traits that I think is really important, and that's creativity. Oftentimes, and again, this is a general statement, so there are certainly anomalies, but in my experience, those individuals that are incredibly creative tend to be perhaps a little bit more introverted and less assertive. Well, you don't want the assertive individuals who are perhaps not as creative as the creative individuals to outshine the creativity of those who are less likely to express it, because sometimes the creativity is the most important piece in every team, thinking outside of the box, throwing everything at the wall, and then analyzing the benefits and the disadvantages of whatever that particular idea is. So we're on assertiveness. That's something that's often required, but you have to that there's got to be a good balance there. Depending on the team you're talking about, empathy. I think empathy and sympathy. I talked about that briefly in the form of a doctor, but for teams, that's incredibly important, especially if, let's say, you're within a nonprofit organization and you have a team that's focused on helping those that are perhaps battered women. And you typically, if you have someone that is in charge of the team, maybe going out and trying to figure out what are the causes, the women that have come to the organization. And again, I'm just making this up just to give you an idea, but you need someone that's empathetic. They understand and they're attuned to other people's emotions. They're compassionate overall, and they can relate to other people's feeling. If you have someone that doesn't have any of those traits, doesn't have the empathy trait, and I see this common in nonprofits, if you have a leader who's not empathetic at all, or someone in charge of a team who has no empathy or sympathy, it's really hard to accomplish the overall goal that you're trying to do when that's one of the number one requirements for being successful. Another trait that I think is key, and you'll see this of people throughout your life, is analytical thinking. Again, just like everything we've been talking about, depending on what a particular goal's strategic objective is, you may need engineer type minds, those that are generally much more analytical. They're logical, they're very systematic in their approach, and they're objective. Facts are how they live and die. They don't use emotion, so maybe they have a little bit less sympathy. Not to say that you can't be an analytical thinker and have sympathy or empathy, but in the manner in which they approach things, it's very systematic, they're very objective, and they excel at the critical thinking and the problem solving. I've been on so many teams. I've created teams within our organizations and our businesses. And when you have uh, a particular problem that you're trying to tackle, often someone with that technical, analytical, logical thinking is so important to achieving a particular outcome, whether it's developing a new product, whether it's you have an issue within the organization in terms of operations or logistically speaking, and you're trying to figure out a way to either cut costs or be more efficient. This concept of kind of having a systematic approach and being very logical in your thinking is often so crucial to arriving at the ultimate outcome. And so we're going to talk about how these traits combine when you're balancing a team. And we'll talk more about the analytical side and balancing with some of the other traits that we're talking about here. I mentioned this before, but creativity, again, creativity is so important when you're trying to come up with new products, when you're trying to solve solutions to problems. All of these things, all of these personality traits, if combined well within a team, just they're duplicative, or they compound, like the compound effect. You can have one individual and have them solve a problem, but if you're talking about massive problems or changes that you need to make, or a big solution that has a meaningful impact to your business, typically you're going to get the best outcome by combining individuals' personality traits. And I've never met anybody that has the perfect personality traits for every situation. I don't think that exists. And anybody who says that they have all the traits required for any situation and they can be a one man team is likely lying or very overconfident or narcissistic, and they're dead wrong. As a matter of fact, they're more likely not to have any of the personality traits that you might need. So, creativity, they're imaginative, they're innovative, they're original individuals who generate a lot of different ideas and solutions. And sometimes those types of individuals can be challenging to work with because they might be so far in left field. But you got to remember that someone who's naturally creative, there's a huge benefit of that, even though sometimes you might have to rein them in. And so that's why this next trait is extremely important. I was serving on a municipality, a team, or a, what do you call it? A committee, if you will, for a local municipality here in the area, here in Phoenix. And I eventually left due to work constraints. I had too much workload. But a secondary factor for leaving was it was very clear to me that the manner in which the municipality had organized this particular committee had basically rendered it meaningless from the very start because they really allowed anybody to be on it. And in the first few meetings we couldn't even get past the definition of the word the to accomplish anything, let alone accomplish the overarching goal, which was pretty significant for the city that we were working for to accomplish. And it was related to their general plan and strategic plan in 10, 15, 20 years, might have even been 30 years. But it was clear to me that the personality traits had not been combined and that this committee was going to have a very tough time succeeding in accomplishing their ultimate goal. Now, they'll produce something. I know they'll produce something, but will it be the best outcome that could be accomplished? No. And for those of us who have been in bureaucracy or been in government, not that, there's lots of bureaucracy in larger organizations, this is often a huge failure when teams are created just based on seniority or teams are created based on who's the best friend of this particular individual creating the team, and it can lead to disastrous results. And this concept of what we're talking about, and I know we're talking about specific traits, but uh, is I've just seen it in so many ways where it hasn't been done, and ultimately can be very frustrating for everybody on the team. And so you end up having team members quit because you can see that it's just not going to work out. So that leads to leadership. We were talking about creativity, and often those people can be pretty creative, but you ultimately need on teams at least one leader and one person in charge, because it's good to have a whole plethora of ideas, but sometimes in order to get something accomplished, and this was one of the other frustrating things that I experienced with this committee for the municipality, was there was no organization, there was no one leader, and everybody's thoughts were I don't everybody's thoughts should be welcome, but we just kind of they went everywhere, and there was never someone that said, okay, all these great ideas, we're going to do this, 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 and this. You have to do that to eventually uh, have an outcome and be successful. You can't explore, 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 and never have any decision making. And so, oftentimes, with successful teams, you have a leader at the top, and ultimately, they have the last say. Again, if they're the right leader, they're taking everybody's advice and opinions and the creativity and all utilizing all the benefits of the personality traits of the individuals that make up the team. But you have to have someone that ultimately has the say so you can move forward and you're not stuck in neutral constantly. So, leadership, they're influential individuals. Sometimes they're visionaries, they're motivational individuals. They have the power of persuasion, and they can work with people. Good leaders can work with people, listen to people, and ultimately take all of the ideas that have been put forward and choose what they believe is best to move forward and start going down a particular path. Attention to detail. I talked about this particular trait briefly when I was talking about a doctor. This is so important no matter what uh, team you're trying to develop. You'll have people who are kind of all over the board, generally high strategic thinkers in the sense that they can grasp well with overall concepts, or maybe more strategic concepts. But when it gets down to the tactics, to the specific details, they're maybe not so strong. That's where you need people that have the personality trait of attention to detail. They're meticulous, they're thorough, they're very precise, and they excel at spotting and correcting errors. And that's often combined with analytical and logical analytical people. They have a systematic logical approach, so they're more attentive to details. You can see how some of these personality traits, and you think about the people in your lives or the personal and professional lives, some of these traits kind of combine, or people that generally have this particular trait, logical thinking, also have this particular trait, attention to detail. Although that's not always the case. And I know lots of people who are incredibly logical, but they're not very attentive to detail. So, again, we're just exploring some of what I have experienced are the most important traits to think about when you're creating teams, but this is by no means an exhaustive or comprehensive list. Persuasiveness, I talked about this one just briefly. You do eventually, when you have so many ideas, have to have someone, or and often this is with the leader, who's relatively persuasive. They're can help convince or bring other people along to some of the ideas, whether it was their idea or someone else. Some of the descriptions or kind of traits that descriptors that fall for someone that's or fall under the category of being influential are very similar to a leader, um, or not influential, persuasive. They're influential, they're charismatic, they're generally outgoing, and they can help garner an overall result by bringing other people, helping them understand, okay, I understand what you're saying. I like that idea. And so, another example of where maybe a leader, typically they have to have some level of persuasion or personality trait, the ability to persuade to a certain extent. Another one that I think, initiative. Really, you want everybody on the team to be proactive and self starting. But oftentimes, if you have too many of those, uh, initiative is often something that's an entrepreneur or a leader. They are self generated, they're self motivated individuals. You want someone that has that self initiative. And there are people who, when I think about it and I think about how well the world works, you have people that are leaders and you have people that are followers. And I think those are both equally important. And in spite of the fact that our society tends to draw ourselves towards leaders, those leaders are nothing without people who are willing to listen and help them build and create. And so if you have someone that's self motivated, generally combined with leadership, um, if they use it well and they know the power of those traits, they'll be able to bring people along. Kind of ties in with persuasiveness, people that can actually help them accomplish the overall strategic mission that they're trying to accomplish. Now, those are the traits, the ones that I think are particularly important. How do you identify these? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I think we talked a little bit about it. If I'm looking at someone and I'm hiring for them, it's hard to identify personality traits within a short period of time, depending on which ones you're talking about. But if you're interviewing one or you're trying to create a team, they're people you know, if you've worked with them in the past, you can usually pick out some of these personality traits. But it's also important, I think, to ask others around them. And that's when you're hiring. That's why we ask for references. That's one way that we try to identify the personality traits of someone that you may want to bring into your company. Ask the individual themselves. Ask them, what do you think are your personality traits? And you'll have a good idea of whether they're lying or not. Number one, you also have a good idea, and lying isn't the right word. You'll have a good idea of whether they've thought about this and they've done some self reflective or self assessment. And in my experience, those who are able to answer that question relatively well, it's clear, and not just read, oh, okay, if you ask about this, this is, but you can tell it's something that they really have thought about. Um, may be good hires, because I hire for personality, because you can't really change that or alter that, or you can't teach that. Honesty, work ethic, but integrity, you can train. You can train for a lot of talents. And so when you're thinking about how you identify these, okay, ask them yourselves, ask people around them, and then there are a lot of tests out there, probably all heard of different ones. The Myers-Briggs is one of the most possible, or one of the most well known. That's a personality test, really. And I know of one president and CEO of a bank that basically won't hire anybody without having them take this external assessment. And I don't remember the name of it, but he has found it incredibly meaningful for hiring for certain positions and overall building his team, because it finds a way of identifying personality traits without the individual who's actually taking the test knowing exactly what they're looking for. And that's what a lot of these personality tests are trying to accomplish. The best cannot be manipulated. So we've talked about the importance of personality traits. We've talked about now what are some of the ones that I believe are particularly important, and how you can identify them. I want to conclude this by talking about how do you use this information to build effective, dynamic, and hopefully fun teams. And it's far more complex than just putting a group of individuals together, as we've said. It really does require the thoughtful consideration of how these different personality traits can complement and support each other. And so I want to use an example of everything that we've talked about and how a great team can be put together. Think about the Chicago Bulls. When I was growing up, I loved watching Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls. And what always fascinated me as a kid was just how well they all worked together. Now, do you think that happened on accident? No. Phil Jackson, their head coach, was an incredibly gifted coach that knew how to piece personality traits together. You had Michael Jordan, who was more of an extrovert, incredibly talented. They were all incredibly talented. So again, we're focusing on personality traits, but so many people on that team, I mean, they had the talent. That was just the basic. Phil, you wouldn't be in Phil Jackson's office, or be even being considered to be put on the Chicago Bulls team. And I'm talking the Chicago Bulls team of the late 90s, where they won all those championships and they were just so much fun to watch. Or maybe it was the early 90s. I don't really remember, but I just remember watching the NBA finals. They always seemed to be in it, and it was so exciting. And even as a young kid, and perhaps this is the entrepreneurial side of me, I was always fascinated by how well they fit together and how well each of the individual teams or players on that team played their role. And now that I've grown and matured and experienced life, that was no accident and was really a combination of looking at personality traits. Michael Jordan was a leader, incredibly gifted. He was kind of the top of the team. There was no question about that. Then you had Scottie Pippen. He was, I would say, a secondary leader. He understood that Michael Jordan was kind of the leader of the team, but he stepped up when he needed to, and those two worked very well together, at least on the court. Now, I know there's a new documentary out. It's not that new, on Michael Jordan. I don't remember the name of it. And there's been some back and forth between Pippen and Jordan about what was true and what everybody's personalities were. But at least looking on the court and how they interacted together and what they were able to accomplish together, was always, I always was impressed. But Scottie Pippen was an excellent backup leader, if you will, and he played his important role. And then you had someone like Dennis Rodman, who was a very interesting, dare I say, odd individual on and off the court, but he was an incredible rebounder, and he was kind of that creative, go anywhere, do anything, just make it happen type of individual. And I think the personality traits. So let's just break Michael Jordan. Okay, he was a leader. He was very persuasive. Now, I've heard he was persuasive sometimes by force, which maybe isn't the best way, but sometimes that's necessary. Obviously, he was incredibly self motivated. He didn't get to where he was by not being self motivated. I think all of them took initiative and were self motivated. And as I said before, ideally, you have a team where everybody making up that team takes the initiative and has that kind of self starter attitude. When you look at Scottie Pippen, I think he had some of those leadership qualities, but he knew his role within the overall organization. And Michael Jordan was kind of the top there. And I think, he likely generated, when I looked at Scottie Pippen, he seemed to be more of a logical, analytical thinker, very systematic in his approach. Not to say that Jordan wasn't, but I think he was the glue that really held the team together. Dennis Rodman, more that creative, uh, out there type of individual that sometimes needed to be reined in, as I said, in and off the court, but was such a crucial part of the team in terms of his skills, rebounding. He just did whatever he needed to for the team. And then you had someone like Steve Kerr. Steve Kerr, I always really enjoyed watching because he was more of what I would call your, now as he's become a coach, maybe this wasn't true, but in his role on that team, more of an introvert. You didn't hear about him all the time. He wasn't grabbing all of the headlines, but he was there and he was no less important than Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman, because when they needed those crucial 3 points, he was there. He was an incredible guard and he supported the team overall, even though his overall manner and demeanor, he was kind of in the shadows, behind the curtain, if you will. Now, that's an example from basketball and thinking about these different traits. And we saw how Phil Jackson combined those personality traits to create arguably one of the best teams of all time. That doesn't mean there weren't fights and there weren't issues within the team, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Sometimes people's their personality traits stay the same, but you get tensions or hostilities, or one person that was on the team it worked well, and then their time had kind of passed. You do have to balance teams. So think about something within your business or your organization that you're trying to accomplish, and you need to create a team. Think about how, just as Phil Jackson combined the Chicago Bulls and utilized the different personality traits to create such a winning championship team, how can you do that with the team you're trying to create? I think it's really important for you to first understand what is the purpose of the team that you're trying to create. If you don't know the purpose, if you're the one creating it and you don't know the purpose of the team, you're setting it up for failure. So you have to know, why are you creating the team? I've seen this in large organizations. They create teams just to create teams. Well, what's the point? Or they have committees just to have committees. And this is where one of those examples where you get meeting to death. Don't have a meeting just to have a meeting. Have meetings that have succinct purposes, that you understand what the goal and objective of the meeting. You bring the right people into the meeting, not just anybody or everybody, and you accomplish what you need to in an efficient manner. And I think that's a failure in a lot of organizations. Is just, we have a meeting because this is how we always did it. Very similar concept to teams. You create a team for a purpose. They have to have a purpose. And then you can lay out, obviously, the timeline for what you're trying to accomplish. And when you think about who's going to be on this team, start combining personality traits. Okay, if you need a leader, think about who's going to take the leadership role. If you need someone that's going to make sure the errors and everything are corrected, or they take a very systematic approach, get someone who's generally logical. You're also going to need someone that's very attentive to detail. That may be the same person, it may be two different individuals or a combined group of individuals. If you're trying to create a new product, oftentimes having an engineer is very, very important. They have that more logical, analytical mind, and that's going to be important in understanding or thinking about how the product can work or be developed. If you're trying to come up with a completely new idea, or as I've said earlier, a solution to a challenging problem, having someone that's creative, that's not afraid to think of everything or throw things at the box, and that often results in the best ideas. Some of the most creative ideas turn into something that's really, really, really incredible. I've talked in the past how, for, I think it's Procter and Gamble, maybe it was Family SC Johnson, a family company. I don't remember. Johnson and Johnson, maybe. Um, Forgive me for not remembering, but the Swiffer was one of the most successful things. And they just analyzed a team. They put together a team and they analyzed, how are people cleaning. And you probably had someone on the team that was incredibly creative, thought outside the box, and said, well, wait a minute. Why don't we do this? And then you had an analytical person that said, okay, well, we can build it or we can accomplish it like this. You're starting to see, and you've likely seen in your life, how the best teams are not just thrown together. They are carefully constructed and strategically put together by those forming the teams. And this is just as true within your organization, within your business, as it is for large organizations or, management teams, whatever the team may be. And I think we've got so much going on as business owners, small business owners and entrepreneurs. And let's say you're a relatively small company, 20 people or less, not that the size matters. Sometimes you forget that this concept is just as important when you're small, and I would argue even more important when you're small, uh, as it is when you're larger. And because at the top of this podcast, we talked about how the importance of personality traits, whether within a team or whether in your organization, are crucial to the overall culture of your organization. And culture eats strategy for breakfast every day of the week and twice on Sundays. I've said that before. I'm going to say it again, and you'll likely say it multiple times throughout this podcast because it's so often forgotten. The most successful organizations have the best cultures, and that's how they get the best results. That's the same within an organization or within a team. Culture is important, and that culture is derived from personality traits. So think about when you're creating that team and what you're trying to accomplish, think about the importance of bringing these different personality traits together and piecing them such that the ultimate goal that you're trying to accomplish and the team who's supposed to accomplish that goal is being set up for success, not failure. Well, that's all the time that we have for this week's episode of the podcast. If you heard something that you found particularly motivating or inspiring, or you have something to add, reach out to me on our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. You can shoot me an email. Follow me on Twitter. Shoot me a tweet saying, hey, I love this portion of the podcast, or you missed this, or A Holland Podcast. That's my Twitter handle. This podcast only grows by your support and by you sharing it with other people. So if you found something that was helpful for you, please share this with other people. Let them know about the Andrew Holland Podcast, because my original mission from the beginning was to grow the podcast and to have a collective community of business owners and entrepreneurs who can act as a support system for each other, discuss all these concepts in open, non-threatening environments, and be a support system through the highs and the lows of entrepreneurship. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Andrew Holland Podcast. Remember, this is a financial podcast. Sometimes we talk about legal concepts. Sometimes we talk about investment ideas. Don't take anything you hear from this podcast or any other podcast as the gospel truth and apply it to your exact situation and run into trouble. Make sure you're always consulting the appropriate legal and professional individuals for your specific situation. Thank you so much for joining us again. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast, for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.